Lecture. I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight for the lecture, and also take the opportunity to thank our sponsor, Tecnoglass, for their sustained support. This is the 4th year that we are offering support for our lecture series, so we are very grateful for the sustained support. Now this year we are doing things a bit differently because we have a panel discussion after the lecture. And my colleague, Professor Alan Schumann, is going to introduce later that part of the program. And the Tecnoglass series is a themed lecture series, and this year we are looking at housing from different angles: technological, social, geographic. Tonight we are delighted to welcome Franco Micucci, who will present a particular perspective from Venezuela. Franco is a Venezuelan architect with degrees from Universidad Simón Bolívar and Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's currently the chair of the architecture department at Universidad Simón Bolívar, where he has been a professor since 1993. Franco has also been a visiting professor and lecturer at several universities at home and abroad, including MIT, Harvard, as well as leading institutions in Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, Puerto Rico, Uruguay, and Spain. His firm has developed over 100 projects in Venezuela and has received multiple awards and honors, including nominations for the Rogelio Salmona Latin American Architecture Award and Oscar Niemeyer Architecture Award. He served as the Venezuela curator for the Bienal Iberoamérica de Arquitectura y Urbanismo and is member of Fundación Espacio, an organization that has promoted architecture and urban design in Venezuela for more than 10 years with exhibitions, lectures, conferences, and publications. Please join me in welcoming Franco Micucci.
Good evening. Thank you, Rodolfo, for the kind introduction and Adib for the organization of this event. I'm very happy to be in Miami, a city that is very familiar for a lot of Venezuelans these days. The lecture actually I was actually asked about this issue of housing, and I decided to talk about public housing and formal urban development in Caracas, based on the fact that Venezuela is one of the most urbanized countries in the world, with almost 93% of its population living in cities. The advent of the petroleum exploitation, which began as early as the 1920s in Venezuela, propelled by American oil companies as well as some others, ultimately changed the economic structure of the country and accelerated the shift from a less productive agricultural activity to a more consumer-related economy with heavy importation financed by the oil company. Jobs emerged in the cities, and with them an amazing train drive that pushed the country's urban agenda forward, and migration to Venezuela's urban areas progressed quickly. By 1960, more than 50% of Venezuelan population lived in cities. Nearly 50 years become the world in general reached that the same marker. A great deal can be learned by observing the urbanization pattern of the city of Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, which grew from 136,000 people in 1935 to nearly 4 million in year 2000, nearly 30 times in 45 years. How exactly this urban process occurred in terms of formally settlements poses an interesting question. patterns reveal an integrate synergy between the two, the formal and informal city, that merits a deep analysis with a certainly produce a new historical knowledge about contemporary urban issues, tendencies about urban concentration, and the socioeconomic consequences of that. As you see in the photograph, Caracas is a city that is pretty much defined by the physical structure of the site, which is topographically very integrated, with major system of water running from the mountain to the valley, which is pretty much the flat area that is in white, in which you can almost not separate whatever is built from the green areas of the city. It is actually a city that, as I said before, by 1929 was pretty much a small town. Venezuela didn't have the strong 19th century as places like Mexico, Argentina, or Brazil had. Basically, the country was pretty much destroyed after the independence war, and then a political crisis that derived into civil wars and the destruction by earthquakes, diseases, and everything. Pretty much kept the center of Caracas as small as that figure, and the rest of the valley was pretty much agricultural land, with the exception of small towns like Chacao, Petare, Baruta, small places I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. So this is not an image from 1929, it's an image from the 1950s, but it shows more or less what the city center of Caracas looked like after the process of densification, but pretty much preserving the sort of horizontal quality of the beginning of the century. The modernization process of the city began by expanding some of the major arteries of the city, like Avenida Urdaneta, in order to incorporate new vertical development with the presence, again, of American companies, and investment related to oil, finance, and new institutions for the country. By 1934, the expansion of the city requested the occupation of the land that was pretty much privately owned. So basically, these different pieces were developed by private developers that owned the land. Basically, they were residential areas that were pretty much conceived based on the suburban model of urbanization. Some of these areas closer to the city center somehow actually had the capacity not only to solve the housing or the residential condition, but also incorporated major oil corporations like the Shell building, later on Comandancia General de la Marina in Caracas. Obviously, with this oil expansion, we had golf courses in Caracas. This is an image of the Caracas Country Club. Again, it's one of these areas that was developed on Hacienda. It is actually a project by the Olmsted brothers who came to Venezuela as part of the colonization process of the valley and the urbanization that quickly changed or transformed the pattern or the system or the traditional lifestyle of the city of Caracas. The car actually was the instrument in order to organize this transformation. Basically, the modernity demanded or requested the possibility to expand the city by including a major system of infrastructure during the 1950s. It's actually the time in which the country reached its highest level of richness. It was actually the first oil producer of the world. We are talking about a period of time in which Venezuela was actually under dictatorship. So the money actually facilitated the possibilities for the state or the government in order to develop major public infrastructure such as the campus of Universidad Central de Venezuela by Villanueva, most important Venezuelan architect from the 20th century, as well as some residential development by the private sector like Las Mercedes, in relationship to a major oil corporation, a major hotel owned by the Intercontinental Hotel. Again, it's a sort of a suburban neighborhood in which workers from these oil corporations or local people that used to live in the center and now moved to the periphery could have a different lifestyle with the automobile as the main instrument for the functioning of the city. By 1967, already democratic period, Venezuela is in democracy since 1958. It's actually one of the oldest, well, it used to be one of the oldest and most stable democracies in Latin America. So this expansion process actually took over some of the other valleys of the city by private development or public housing in general, which are these great areas on the expansion of the black previous shadow of the city. Some informal development already happened in the city since the 1950s, and you actually will see that in the following image. Infrastructure was the key to develop the city back then in the 60s. And by 1990, with the opening of the liberal economy in the country, the consolidation of the autonomy of municipalities as a political structure for the city in order to administrate, to manage the future of the city, began back then. Basically, as you see here, the valley is pretty much complete, and you see these gray areas here that are somehow the densest area of the city, which are pretty much spontaneous settlements, considered ornate barrios in our culture, and they're somehow taking the peripheral spaces that were available because they were pretty much public land or national parks. So, given the fact that this rich country was in a position to fund important public housing programs since the 1920s, in several areas of the city through an institution called Banco Obrero, Workers' Bank. It was supposed to be an institution to finance social housing, especially for the new immigrants of the cities that were supposed to be the workers. This is one of the most important projects, back from the 1940s. It's actually called El Conjunto Residencial del Silencio, Residential Complex by Bienal again. It's basically on the basis of the international style system, basically horizontal buildings that increase the density of the downtown area of the city that used to be only 1 or 2 stories high. These housing blocks actually define a plaza in relationship to the geography of the city, incorporated commercial activity on the ground level, as well as covered arcades that will allow pedestrians to walk under the shadow and without the impact of the rain. Also, one of the important things of this project, Villanueva incorporates sort of neoclassical or neo-colonial features on the exterior of the buildings, whereas the inside, the interiors of the superblocks actually were pretty much modern, with the incorporation of features as the kitchen, as a way to understand the relationship of the mothers with the children on the gardens of the superblocks. This is an aerial image of the project these days, which is pretty much well preserved. It's actually a very good example that social housing is not about the provision of residential units, it is about the construction of good cities. And that's one of the main ideas I want to raise on this lecture. And it's based on the fact that social housing should also promote the integration of different uses, activities, as well as the diversity that is necessary to incorporate communities into city centers, particularly like this, but also as for the expansion of new areas of the city. Back then, by the 1950s, new typologies emerged in the country on the basis of Le Corbusier, Unité d'Habitation by architect Guido Bermúdez, who developed this particular building, 40 stories high, 140 units, on the periphery of Caracas, in a place called El Valle, the valley, one of the peripheral valleys, that, as you see in the photograph, very quickly began to be occupied by informal development, as well as some other public housing projects back from the 60s and 70s. And in fact, this is one of the questions of the lecture, which is what is surprising about this integration is that in both cases, informal settlements began to form themselves in the vicinities of these housing projects. So there is a constant relation in between them, because in the end you could realize that some of the construction, even though it could be weak or really not stable, they're somehow a sub-product of the modern typology of construction that was actually learned by the workers of some of these housing projects, that during the week were working on the formal housing projects, and during the weekend were doing the houses for the families and so on. Again, Villanueva with a new project from the 50s. Cerro Piloto is the name of the area that was actually developed by the state, by the government. We're talking about dictatorship back then in the 50s. And we're talking about 40 buildings, pretty much under the Le Corbusier landscape idea for the modern city, basically by developing terraces on the particularly heavy topography of the site, very close to the city center, with the major road system in order to give access to the people that eventually have to have cars in order to get here, with spaces in between the buildings that didn't allow integration in between them. Basically, some of these slopes are actually not that stable because of the movement of the land, and the solution pretty much opened up this landscape of modern city in the center of Caracas. But the project itself not only didn't solve the problem of informal settlements around, and they actually came back. They actually took over some of the portions of the land that remained empty or underdeveloped. And actually, the result of that is a community that is a hybrid condition in which the superblocks are no longer in such a good conditions in terms of problems with water, services, obviously crime in this kind of neighborhoods. And then the conditions of the barrio probably allow for integration in between different sectors of the formal community. This process went on during the 60s, probably on the peripheries of Caracas. There was no more land in the city center for this. And the process probably incorporated new typologies, new solutions with local architects as well. But then the issue of informal housing came along with the process of construction of most of these housing projects on the side again, and we very little care about the conditions of the infrastructure of those sites. The 70s obviously is one of the moments in which Venezuela reached one of the highest oil prices in its history, and allows some architects to think about or to manipulate the needs for social housing to incorporate these new technologies for prefabrication as the response for massive housing projects. Again, in this case, new architect Daniel Fernandez shows, U-SoA and Associates developed this massive compound in Caracas city center along Avenida Bolívar, which is the area which in the end had the compound of El Silencio, the other project by Villanueva. There were supposed to be 7 probably more complexes like this along the avenue in order to somehow complete the project. Was never completed. This Parque Central complex actually works as a city within the city because it actually has commercial activity, institutional building, museum, shopping centers, as well as office towers. So the idea of mixing uses for social housing projects, even though it didn't end up being so social, they actually became middle-class apartments mostly. But they actually raised the question of this new lifestyle in the city center of Caracas by concentrating activities within the center of the complex. The 90s actually were not probably the most clear time, 90s and the 2000s. In general, the housing programs actually concentrated on delegating the activity to commercial or to private entrepreneurs to develop housing complexes like this on the periphery of Caracas, probably moving out from the city center and the valley to the peripheries of the metropolitan area, in which there is a great dependence on the car, on the connectivity to the city, lack of services, institutions, schools, and so on. The revolution began in 1988, but nothing happened in terms of social housing. There was a major division in the political leaders of the revolution about the needs to improve the condition of the informal development or the informal urban areas of the city, or the people from the right wing of the government, let's say the military, that were in favor of doing more housing programs in Venezuela, doing satellite socialist cities in the periphery of Caracas, and more recently, since 2011, Gran Misión Vivienda developed buildings like this everywhere in Caracas, no matter the conditions of the site or the geography or the climate. Very poor in terms of the architecture, but worse than that is the missed opportunity to create urban solutions for sites that were actually very critical in terms of the location, possibilities, mostly taking over land that was underdeveloped or empty, owned by private people that probably were not compensated by the process of development. And to finish this long introduction, Torre de David, probably one of the most iconic projects of the revolution for the last 20 years, by this community that took over this major commercial tower that was actually developed in the 1990s, that was never opened because of the collapse of the bank activity in Venezuela back in 1994-95. So a community began to take over through a mafia process, partially and gradually the building, until it got to this point. Now the building is empty again after the major propaganda that this site had, after the Venice Bienal proposal of the group Caracas Urban Think Tank. So now the building is empty. It was actually given to a Chinese corporation that's going to do something with it. It was part of a commercial agreement. So the result of this process is this complex city, difficult to understand and to map. I'm not going to show that many spaces. We have had the chance to study the city, both academically and professionally, through competitions, commissions, as well as independent studies that we have had done. But I'm going to concentrate only on 5 examples. One urban study and 4 architectural projects that somehow try to raise the issue of habitat in the city and not so much about housing. So in this sense, I'm going to go quickly to a very recent study that we have done for the municipality of El Hatillo, one peripheral municipality of Caracas. And the project understood as an urban integration plan between the historic center and Barrio El Calvario, which is an informal community very close to it. It's part of a program that became a study at the university, and it became a formal project and plan, an urban plan for the city in order to improve the relationship between these 2 units, as well as the condition of each one of them. It is a historic center that became a commercial area, very touristic for the inhabitants of Caracas and people that come to the city. It is an area that's very particular because it's very peripheric, it's actually peripheral, it used to be agricultural land. There's only few areas that are still agricultural areas. Some of them were actually transformed into golf courses as well. It's actually sort of a suburban location with a lot of residential activity, either in vertical solutions or private houses. A lot of green areas that actually surround this major element that is actually the core of the city because of the historic condition, but it's also because it's the only place in which you get commercial activities and services for the community around the site. The conditions of the barrio, as you see here, are density, capacity, obviously probably sort of evidence of chaos in terms of services with the blue water tanks on the terraces of the top of the houses, but as a major scenario of density that is part of probably the attributes of this kind of communities in a place like this. Versus this other image where you see the barrio in relationship to the beautiful green context in which this idea of a compact city actually finds opportunities to create open spaces around it instead of within itself. The first key of the plan is actually about the necessity to integrate barrios to the formal city around them. Basically, in this case, it's about the integration of the barrio with the historic center of El Hatillo that has its own problems. Also because a lot of the people from that community actually live or work or make daily life actually in the community of the historic center, but also because there is actually a tradition, either religious or cultural, to go up to El Barrio El Calvario in processions that they sang in several periods of the year as part of the history of the site. This actually has to do with the physical transformation of the public spaces, not only for the barrio, as well as for the historic center, removing somehow gradually or partially the car from the city, making something as simple as sidewalks in several areas, or making pedestrian connections that will actually integrate the barrio with the center of the town. Part of the strategy of the projects actually has to do with the incorporation of these green areas that are somehow either educational facilities as this high school, primary schools, or the agricultural land around the barrio in order to take advantage of the possibilities of this, also as a touristic event, but also a productive site for the community of the barrio, as well as for the historic center, which is actually full of restaurants in a way. So the idea of having a sustainable community has to do with the fact that the improvement of the environmental conditions taking advantage of the issue of water management, as well as the productivity associated with the agricultural land, as well as with the nurseries for plants, that is part of the great attributes of this area of Caracas, will create a social benefit for the community by integrating these 3 conditions. So again, this condition of water related to the green spaces around the site actually allow us to develop projects that will somehow understand the conditions of the water as the basic urban structure of the plan of the area in order to preserve some of the green spaces within the barrio as well as outside the barrio. And the third idea has to do with the organization of communities into smaller condominiums, as they could be called, or housing blocks, or urban blocks, blocks that will somehow reinforce the condition of safety as well as social organization for the general community of the barrio. This has to do with the notion that some of the streets of these communities are public, some others have to be private because of safety conditions. In general, what they do is they put fences on the staircases in order to avoid strangers to go by. So they name themselves condominiums because of that. They actually block the path of public strangers into the area, so they find themselves as enclosed communities that could actually become an opportunity, as I said before, to preserve some of the empty land that these communities have in order to have children's playground spaces for the elderly or for the young, as well as community gardens that could be part of the economy of the town, in which there is a lot of evidence of green areas on top of the houses, like nurseries, as well as the incorporation of commercial activities around the public spaces of the community, as well as the conditions of the management of water by collecting water on top of the houses in order to make feasible this idea of community agriculture in the area. So the precarious condition of the infrastructure and some of the structures of the house have to do with this notion of the house as a productive unit in which the community somehow solves the condition of the residential solution by subdivision of units and everything, but also this idea of the house as a place in which green areas are actually incorporated on top of the houses, as well as commercial activity along the public spaces in order to improve, again, the social condition. And eventually you will have restaurants not only in the historic center, but also in the barrio as part of this process of integration, which is something that's already happening not only by physical work, but also by the work of artists and communities that are not from the barrio, that are working with local actors in order to improve the integration between the historic center and the barrio itself. So this idea of the greenery of the house is also a way in which the community solves the humidity problem of the site by absorbing the humid condition of the area. Another notion is about the services, in this case, that the community needs. For instance, this is an area for an elementary school, a basic school that is there in very poor conditions, with a major green areas around it. We could have sport facilities, maybe a pool, or even a nursery for the agricultural activity of the compound, collecting water from the top and using that as an advantage to preserve, as I said before, some of the open space around the barrio and the connection between the barrio and the formal communities around them. So again, the conditions of the infrastructure of the school versus a public project by the municipality in order to improve the condition of the public space and create conditions of privacy and subdivision by using the topography as the instrument to control, to guarantee safety, but at the same time creating different conditions of open spaces, because in general, infrastructures in these kind of environments have to do what they serve for the community, for the children, as well as for the strangers, because they become sort of educational facilities, cultural facilities, community facilities for the barrio. The conditions of the infrastructure, again, along the ravine or the stream, Quebrada del Arroyo, as it's called, has to do with the fact that we have to clean the conditions of the water in that area. Again, solving the conditions of infrastructure across the site in order to connect properly the barrio at different levels with the high school and the communities that are around. And also solving the conditions of a marketplace that is on the bottom of the site, like that. So as an entryway to this linear element that will connect the historic center with the barrio at different stations, opening up the space because of the risky condition of some of these houses that are actually on top of the stream, of the ravine, that could become an open public space with basic system of mobility, of transportation, as simple as a funicular that will actually allow for connectivity at different levels of the barrio from the very bottom. It could become also a touristic opportunity, as it has happened in Guayaquil, Ecuador, with Barrio Santa Ana. This will allow for images like this to be something like that, so people actually can understand the importance of the barrio as part of the integration of the site. A social program that will allow the integration of community by organizing the condominiums, as I was explained before, an educational process about the notion of infrastructure, social development, and the possibilities of developing architecture through conditions like this. For instance, this map is actually a map of the community understood as a network of producers that could actually find room for a center that will somehow control the production through a website that will allow them to place their products in a place where scarcity of food is actually a major situation these days. This is not a joke, it's a real thing. But again, the idea is this utopian notion that the green condition of the site could actually become the opportunity to solve most of the social and physical problems of the barrio. Now quickly I'm going to move into 4 specific buildings. This is part of a competition that we won several years ago to do a master plan for this, again, historic center, Baruta, again, in the south portion of Caracas, right here, El Atillo, which was the other one was here. A historic center there's very little from the historic condition of the site, barrios around it because of the immigration process, so people that come to these towns in order to feel at home somehow, because they come from small towns as well, and also because of the presence of a new industrial zone back in the 1960s, La Trinidad, a new social housing as well in the area. So the result is a very chaotic landscape with clear evidence of the historic fabric, as well as the barrio and some of the green spaces around. Our project had to do with a community that still preserves the notion of town while they live in a metropolitan area. The competition itself was actually based on the fact that we wanted to develop small architectural projects, very specific sites to solve issues such as transportation, marketplaces, institutional buildings, schools, cultural centers. After that, the mayor of this town actually went to jail because it was against Chavez's government back then. So we have to somehow redefine the project and concentrate only into 4 main projects that were done. Actually, pretty much one of them by us and some other architects as well. And eventually we developed just one of them for construction, which is the town hall. The idea of the mayor was that he had to move the town hall to the city center, somehow to recognize the historic condition of the town, but also as a social agenda to attend the poorer communities of the municipality by physical presence, and not so much the middle and upper classes of the municipality that would actually be served by electronic government. The idea of this project is a hybrid building in which actually concentrate different components of the program in a way that this block that was actually bought by the municipality in order to renovate and demolish the existing constructions in order to place this as an institutional building for the area that somehow would look like that in relationship with 2 plazas, Plaza Bolívar and Plaza Cristo. The second plaza actually became sort of a more institutional space, whereas Plaza Bolívar was kept as a park in front of the church. The space actually will become sort of a continuous ground level with different conditions of the architecture of the building in relationship to the plaza as well as to the other public park, as a consideration of the very heterogeneous condition of the site in terms of materials, silhouettes, borders, uses, and everything. So the notion of this sort of a massive vertical block versus a horizontal structure was actually part of the program to develop sort of a peripheral condition for pedestrians with galleries around it, facing the plaza right there, stepping back somehow the vertical structure of the big office building versus the most civic events of the town hall down here in between the 2 plazas, sort of an underground auditorium, and the city council offices on top of it. The relationship with the plaza and the church was really a critical element for us in order to respect the historical condition of the church as well as the scale of the plaza versus the vertical structure with sort of openings in order to integrate with the center, which is sort of this open space with light and air to connect the different levels of the bureaucratic structure that will lead to a public terrace on the top, which you could recognize actually the conditions of the site, different system of ramps that will allow accessibility at different levels, a perimeter condition of gardens and terraces where people can actually smoke and protect actually the conditions of sun orientation and relationship between the structure and the barrio, somehow chasing the different phases of the building into different conditions to give identity as well as connectivity, visual connectivity with different places, which becomes an excuse for materiality and complexity. The interior space becomes a plaza, as well as a patio, in which actually the most traditional element, which is a patio, almost a symbol of traditional Venezuelan architecture, becomes the most contemporary moment of the project, in which people can actually gather this photo of a good friend of mine who's here actually, and which is the moment in which the community actually entered the building as a way to celebrate the condition of the town hall as a place for the people, which is a function of this building itself. A second project, very quickly, and very short, I don't know how I'm doing in time, but Carlos Urete School is actually a small facility. It was done for the municipality of Chacao. Leopoldo Lopez was actually the mayor of the city. He's now in jail. He was also against Chavez's government, as well as the previous mayor, who was actually candidate for the presidency against Chavez. It actually has to do with a small barrio located here along a ravine or a stream right there. It's a very different condition of barrios, like the ones that we had before, because this barrio actually grows in between formal conditions of the city, like that. So our project had to do with the provision of a new facility for a school that actually work in a small house on top of the ravine right there, which is actually covered by a pedestrian path, which is the access for the barrio. So our project was actually supposed to somehow be an addition to an existing sport facility that was developed by the group of architects, actually a very small school. The municipality had to buy a piece of property, land that was actually empty in order to develop a school. The municipalities in Venezuela do not have control of private land in general. So in case they want to do a public operation, they have to invest money, pay the price of private market in order to develop an institution like this. It's actually a school with some health facilities and spaces for the community that comes at the same time a plaza for the community, as well as a patio for the students of the school. It's actually a very small project that only became an excuse, this sort of background for the most important piece, which is a small unit, which is a library for the community, for the school itself. You can actually get it close, so you actually get views from the context and different conditions of orientation allow us to control periphery, the corridors of the school, which are pretty tiny, and the sustainability, again, conditions of places they need to have natural light and air. And again, this photo has to do with the fact, that when you see this, you realize that you don't know who is coming from the barrio or who's coming from the former city. In the end, public infrastructure has to be equal for everyone. And in general, that's the function of the purpose of architecture in places like Venezuela, which is to relieve social division and probably create the sense of inclusion that we expect from architecture. Finally, two more projects. Petare La Urbina is actually a terminal and a market in a very complex area of the city of Caracas, which is one of the largest barrios of the city. It has almost between 400 and 500,000 inhabitants in total, one of the largest ones in Latin America. All this barrio pretty much takes its way out to a subway station right there, close to the city center of Petare, the historic center. And we were actually asked to somehow not only solve some of the problems derived from the presence of this community, but also about this notion of social division between formal and informal cities, integration again with the historic center of Petare, which was the reason actually for most of these people to come to this place and be close to a small town. This notion of density actually creates problems like this, in which transferring between different systems of mobility occurs on the public space. And basically what happens is that there's this system of occupation of a public space by the presence of public transportation and then pedestrians on the streets and street vendors as a consequence of the incredible activity of the site. This is more or less the area in itself, as we're looking at. Our project was actually not thought as a plan that was actually going to solve the entire problem. It's actually an opportunity to relieve at least the condition of the public space that was never going to be as clean as they expected, but at least to relieve the density of the occupation by using some of the properties that the municipality had in the area, which was this one. It was supposed to be the headquarters building for the municipality, or the town hall. It was never developed, only a portion of it, which is this structure that was never finished. A very precarious post-terminal there and some commercial activity around. So our project was actually to develop some sort of civic center as a way to integrate the barrio, the historic center, and the formal community of La Ruina through a project that will include a marketplace, a bus terminal that will be integrated to the subway station and some other terminals around the area, and a civic center for the municipality as well, as a way to develop somehow the original project of the site. Is somehow a plan of the final phase of the project. We only got to do the first phase because of the lack of resources. Municipalities in general are very poor in Venezuela, so they don't have the resources they should need for projects like this, unless you get an agreement with the central government. There's a political alliances. So this is the plan of the project that originally wanted to be a very open plaza, so street vendors could actually place themselves informally along the roof. That is actually the only feature of the project that was actually built very quickly with very basic materials. It's almost a non-permanent condition of the site as a public occupation of the private land, of the land, in order to solve the perimeter as a bus stop with shops inside for the street vendors that would actually be able to house their merchandise into these small units, defining patios that will somehow integrate the community as well as the kids with the mothers that actually work there. And also an excuse to create some sort of public spaces through this kind of program that will be the capacity of flexibility that we expected from the original project. Finally, a project that is probably at the largest scale that we have done is the most recent one. The two first ones were actually nominated for the Rogelio Salmon Award, and the previous one for the Oscar de Mayer Award as well. This one too, it was actually finished pretty much 2 years ago. It hasn't been occupied completely. It's actually part of the complex of PDVSA. It's actually the oil corporation of the country. It's actually number one from a competition for this incredible site along Avenida Libertador, which is a major avenue of the city, sort of a new oil district for this public corporation that began taking over several pieces of infrastructure of the site, along, again, an informal community that runs along this river, Chacaito, Quebrada Chacaito, major public spaces in the area, such as Sabana Grande. Our project had to do with the possibility to incorporate public facilities to this sort of business or public corporation offices building through a cultural center, library, sport facilities for employees, but also for the community, as well as sort of a small convention cultural center for the oil corporation, but that will work almost as a building unit from the corporation itself. So it's basically a compendium of horizontal buildings that were developed in phases. This was actually a project that we did in a month. It was built in 2 months for a convention in Caracas for OPEC. This is the image of the space inside, and then 2 more buildings that were developed later after that. Sort of the cultural center, the sport facility that was supposed to relocate a sport field that was actually the bottom of the basement and was put on top of that with a gymnasium, a dining hall, and the library for the history of the oil industry in Venezuela, with a cultural center, auditorium building, and exhibition halls on the horizontal building with major presence on the main avenue, which is a highway that the building actually never faced because it was actually facing backwards towards the north. So our intention, even though there was no connections, we have a face for the project to the main avenue of the city with sort of a different structural and tectonic condition because it was actually built on top of a parking structure of the site. So this is it. Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you, the people that have made possible this work. 90% of them are out of Venezuela these days, but we keep on hoping that the situation will get better and eventually some of them will come home.
Thank you, Franco. I'm Alan Schulman. I'm the Director of Graduate Programs in Architecture, and I first of all want to thank you all for coming tonight. And usually this lecture series is held on a Wednesday. The reason we're doing it on Thursday tonight is that tomorrow is our first fall orientation for graduate students here at the University of Miami. I think some of you may be here for tomorrow, so I want to welcome you especially, and I look forward to meeting you tomorrow. And I also want to introduce Henry Rueda. Henry is visiting instructor at the Department of Architecture at FIU's College of Architecture and the Arts. He graduated from the School of Architecture at the Universidad Central de Venezuela and received his master's degree in advanced architectural design from Columbia University. He has taught in leading universities throughout Latin America. I noted that you worked for Viel Arets as well in Holland. And he is a practicing architect both in Venezuela and Caracas and in Miami with several residential projects. He co-founded and directed Espacio 5, an art gallery space opened in 2012, and is co-founder and active member of the Fundación Espacio, which I hope to discuss with you later, I think with Franco. So maybe that's a subject we can get to. So anyway, I look forward to talking further. Can you hear me? All right, well, first of all, Franco, I mean, what is so extraordinary, I think, both in your reputation and also in the projects that you've done, is your engagement at every level of the city, your passion for the city as an academic, as a practitioner, somebody who's interested in the history of the city, the documentation of the city, the buildings of multifunctional uses and how they insert themselves into the city. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about this sort of role of the architect as an urban actor, as somebody who inserts himself at every level of the process of the city and expands the role of the architect, perhaps.
That's a very good question, because in fact, it was the same question I had when I graduated as an architect, because I thought that there was something missing about my own instruction as an architect, which was the city. I mean, even though we had to live with the city as an architect, I thought there was something more that had to be investigated, because otherwise architecture will never be enough in order to be successful in a place like Caracas, where the history was actually so heavy and strong and quick that we never had time enough, like probably to understand the process and probably to be successful as an architect. So again, I decided to make a master in urban design, but not so much interested about the planning process or the sort of urban design master planning condition that some previous professionals in Venezuela had to do. I was actually looking for room for architecture to make better cities. And in general, I found myself in a condition in which I will do master planning in order to understand site conditions. So that will be somehow a good way to find possible projects that will be feasible in terms of short periods of time, scarcity of funds, difficult bureaucratic structures in order to make projects. And you will be learning that, from mistake to mistake. It's not always a linear process of success. Actually, we did a lot of studies and projects that didn't go through. And at the same time, you begin somehow realizing the possibilities you get once you understand that maybe it is a process that goes from general to specific, and then from the specific to the general condition of sort of an urban condition of a site. And as you said, this is something we try to teach to our students. Some of them are here, I guess. I saw some of them. Because I think the responsibility of the architects in general is to provide better cities for people by the construction of public spaces in general. That's why my intention with this lecture is not about talking about housing solutions, it's more about creating conditions to inhabit the city properly, which has to do with the necessity for public spaces, better infrastructure, services for education, culture, sports, which is something that in a city like Caracas that was mostly developed by the private sector actually was missing probably for the last 30 or 40 years, even though there were some good projects previously. I think architects have to go back to public service in a way, either as an independent professional or a public officer in an institution as well.
So is there something about in fact, the difficulty of working in Caracas right now, the complexity that is kind of makes it a great laboratory in a sense, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I would like to add something to that, and it's also the fact that the city is so challenging because of density, as you saw it, because of the topography, because it has a lot of benefits in terms of the perfect weather conditions that the city has, but at the same time is the all the sort of problems that the city has because it's a valley, because the infrastructure is very difficult, because of the fast growth of the city and all the problems that makes it super challenging. It's not like you never have, and it's a conversation we always have here in school, is we never had a rectangular flat site, right? So it's always an irregular shape. It also has topography, and it has a lot of challenges. So I guess also part of the education of an architect in those years that we went to school in the different universities, they had a lot to do with the object, with the building. You know, it's like the 80s, it's postmodernism, and it was all that. And I guess that's kind of what you were looking for when you were looking for an education in the urban field, kind of. And also because the university didn't have any connections between, like Simón Bolívar had the urban studies, but it was now connected to architecture, where now it's like, it's more integrated. Right?
Yeah, I would say that probably the complexity that you refer to is actually also based on the fact that pretty much the city is already all done. So what you do is actually find projects that could be as simple as a sidewalk or a public space on a very abandoned side of the city. And those projects could become almost more relevant than the utopian ideas that we used to probably spend much more time, probably in previous years. I mean, utopia is necessary for the city, but sometimes utopia has to go back to a smaller scale project in which you could have more social impact on the one hand, and there's a lot of people, not only myself, doing that in Venezuela, which I think is something we are grateful for. Sort of, intervention on small communities like this. But at the same time, we cannot forget about the necessity to dream about the future of the city. For instance, the first project I mentioned has a certain dimension of utopia in a way, but it's an utopia not about the built condition of a project, it's probably about the social, economical, and political structures that you need to have in a country in order to make that as a reality, you know what I mean? So in that sense, the difficulty for us as an architect is that we have to work not only on the physical condition of the city, but also on the social, economic, and political structure in order to make feasible projects for the city. And for instance, in that project, I'm only doing sidewalks for the small town, and I'm very happy doing sidewalks. I'm not even getting paid because these municipalities do not have almost any money. Private people probably do not support so much public investment either. So it's difficult. So you have to find out solutions in a moment that is very irregular, very unstable. So as an architect, in a way, you become a sort of a politician, a developer, sort of an entrepreneur for the city. And sometimes you even have to sell your project to the community or to the the institutions in order to make it feasible, which is somehow your invention based on a previous necessity you have to establish. So in this sense, the academy is very important for us because it keeps us active in terms of understanding the city as a process and not as a complete idea.
So was Fundación Espacio part of this agenda as well, of sort of educating and being active and sort of getting engaged in the city?
Yeah. Maybe I can say a few words about Fundación Espacio. So I guess like 12 years ago, Franco and some friends, we started getting together just to talk about projects, to talk about the city. We did it informally in coffee shops or in Franco's office or in my office. And eventually we decided to turn that into public conversations based on the sort of the weakness of the institutions. We didn't have any critical discourse, any critical publications like magazines or any channels to sort of promote the work that we were doing. So it became sort of a legal institution, something that started as a kind of friends getting together to basically talk about architecture. And it was a mix of people from different universities sort of finding a neutral space that was not connected to any of the sort of existing structures that were heavy. They were like hit by the lack of resources. They were like had no budget, no money, nothing, right? So we started just doing this as a passion, basically, and eventually it grew as a forum for discussion for international conferences, books, the one that you have, exhibitions, invited guests, everything, and everything received a massive response of the people, which was great. And the project that we're doing right now in the Fundación, which is Franco is leading with Alice in Caracas for the 450th anniversary of the city with the American architects and something Franco can elaborate better, is something that is the academy and the streets. So it's like teaching, but at the same time it's not framed under a university. It's not practice, because it's not really practice, but it's doing architecture at the same time, and it's finding spaces for democracy for everybody. So it's like the same streets, we had a conversation the other day, the same streets where we're doing the walking tours are the same streets where they were killing people 3 months ago. So it's like rediscovering the city, refinding those spaces and those kind of stages for the urban life, which is in the end what I guess we want, right? Like,
yeah, I guess just one more thing is Fundación Espacio became sort of a collective organization for architects and people who are interested in the city, but also became an opportunity to somehow expand our knowledge to the general community of the city. In fact, I think one of the most important agendas that we have in the academy is how to actually translate or probably incorporate into the general discussion of the city architecture as a public capital for the community, in the sense that, maybe when you don't have like strong media, newspapers and media that can actually somehow multiplicate the message of the academy, you have to find rooms to do that. So we actually, as Henry said, we're trying to went out to the city in order to give lectures, conference, discussions about problems, real problems of the city, with the participation of well-trained professionals in order to, somehow raise the level of quality of the discussion about the city, probably helping people to understand the history and the actual condition of the city, which is very important. There's no way you can actually love a city unless you understand your place. You know what I mean? So, and I think that's something we sometimes forget as architects. We think the city belongs to us, so we don't care about what the rest of the people may think. And in fact, that's quite wrong. I think the city belongs to the people, and we should be a media for them in order to find out solutions for their own problems or dreams in a way. So I think that's the most beautiful part that we have done. And for instance, this project Henry's mentioned is actually a project about the architecture that was done by American architects during the 20th century in Venezuela. So we did a survey of almost 120 buildings, projects, urban plans, landscape projects in Venezuela that were part of the modernization process of the city of Caracas, along with the influence of oil corporation, investors in the city, not only from the US, also from Europe, Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, French people that came to Venezuela because it was a place to go back in the 50s. I mean, it was like a real modern place, with a lot of economic activity. So I think this educational purpose of Fundación Espacio is something that's keep on going on and expanding probably through different instruments or procedures, I guess.
No, I mean, it's remarkably productive. I was looking at the publications that you all are doing. It's quite extensive in a period of crisis as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's really amazing. So tell me a little bit about the role of competitions in Venezuela, because we don't have so many competitions here. It's not really part of the DNA of American practice, unfortunately, but in Europe and in Latin America, quite a bit. And I think especially now in this period of scarcity, it's quite interesting.
Well, Venezuela is not the best example. I mean, Colombia, for instance, has got an amazing program for Chile, or even Mexico or Brazil. But Colombia particularly, because any public project has to go through a public competition in which architects can participate on the basis of a project that has got the money is guaranteed, the site is guaranteed, the approval of the community and institutional structure to be developed is already there. So then the design competition becomes only about the quality of the architectural and urban project, which is really remarkable, because then there is the commitment that the project is going to be built, developed, and you then are somehow delegated the responsibility of make that as a real thing for the community. So which is what we want as architects. We don't want to make just drawings and probably express ideas. We want to make it feasible. Venezuela is not the best example. We try to follow up a little bit the tendency of Colombia, even though the political and institutional weakness of the country doesn't allow for better competitions. And in fact, there are not as many. I probably am the one who has done more competition. Recently, we had won some of them, but we have lost also many. I think competitions are basic because they actually keep you trained. It's almost, if you like to run, you run even if you don't have a purpose. So we compete with ourselves by doing research, but you also compete with some other architects whenever there is a chance to develop a public project or a private project as well, which is also very common. Private competitions are also part of a strategy.
Yeah, one thing also is that Franco's office, they participate in every competition. They have won a lot of them. Not all of them had come to like a happy ending because they don't get billed, they don't get the award, they don't get the prize, they don't get the recognition. It's a soap opera. It's like a whole everything, like all the spectrum. Yeah. But I think that it's also that leads to something that I want to mention of MA Plus or MAMAS, as we call it in Venezuela, which is Franco's office, which is kind of an extension of his practice, of his academia, of his academic sort of practice. So you go to Franco's office and you see all the students and the interns and the recent graduates, and it's his family and it's in his house.
And
so
dogs.
Because if you and the dogs and everything, right? So because if you do competitions, you need to have that training. You need to have that staff that stays all night with you, that is passionate, that can do 3 models in 3 hours. And you don't do that if you have staff that it's like 9 to 5, hourly paid and all that stuff, right? So that extension is something that is remarkable because it's like his life, right? So in that sense, not everybody could have that model, that sort of pattern of practice, and that's what keeps them, busy doing competitions. Like, not everybody can do that. It's not only a matter of money or time, it's also the stamina that you basically have with younger architects. Like, it's like a team of like 3 of us, we're not gonna do it. So you need like that extra, energy.
Connecting the 2 questions, for instance, now Fundación Espacio is also promoting competitions for this program that we're talking about, American Architecture in Caracas, which is that we actually define 10 sites in which there's going to be 10 competitions for young architects in order to somehow develop sort of tactical urbanism or ephemeral architecture or art intervention on the public space around these buildings. So some of them could be built. So we're actually looking for institutions that are going to finance the execution of the projects. So the idea is that somehow we are actually creating new structures for this competition agenda that we think is important for the field of architecture as a way to reach quality. This is actually something we perceive as a new generation that is already somehow stable in the country, even though the circumstances are not. So it is to promote new structures for the future, which I think is important in the end.
So that makes me think of, also the issue of resilience, because, we talk a lot about resilience here. I talk both about the university and the country as a whole and the state now. But when we talk about resilience, sometimes we just think of it like resistance to sea level rise or storm resistance, that sort of thing. But of course, in Venezuela, I think it takes on other meanings, and it probably should for us as well. So, I noticed in many of your projects that they seem almost resilient unto themselves. They seem to be like almost like they could exist autonomously. Yeah. They incorporate, food production and water storage and that sort of thing. But then there's another level of resilience, which would be like, political, social, economic resilience, just building the structures that allow society to keep moving in a very difficult period. I was wondering if you could... talk to that. I mean,
I would say resilience is inherent to human condition these days in Venezuela. I mean, we're survivors, either to get food or find medicine or to, be able to go to one place to the other. So, which is something very unusual for a place like Venezuela that used to have pretty much almost everything. So, architecture, I will say resilience these days has to do with the fact that there is a major social crisis, so architecture has to have a social agenda in the end. So, there's no, it cannot be understood as a design problem, which is sort of a subjective problem about the aesthetics of a project. It is about the real social purpose or benefit of a project, which I think is in the end what our interest is. In fact, we don't care so much about the look of the building, even when we want it to look good. We actually think of the buildings as buildings that pretty much were there. So it's almost non-visible, the impact of the project. At some point, you even forget when they were built. They could be somehow, buildings have been done 10, 15 years ago, or more than that. In fact, they actually become sort of a transition in between different architectural periods. In fact, they're full of reference to previous architects such as Villanueva, Sanabria, some other of the masters from the 20th century. We think as a generation that we have to also the responsibility to link the junior generation to this previous past that has become somehow the vernacular Venezuelan architecture. Modern architecture is somehow our tradition. So we think that the city has to understand the necessity that it has to survive in time, to serve to the people, and then architecture has to have probably a more modest role in its presence in the city. And I think either environmental or social or economic issues are part of the resilience that you were mentioning. So in general, we try to find projects that are feasible in terms of the modesty of resources, but also the impact of the community that's gonna be affected by the project. So in the end, resilience is part of something we do, either public or private, I will say. No, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
One thing that is it's also kind of remarkable is when you, in a country like Venezuela, your relationship with your politicians is so close that it's like a private client almost, right? So when you work, and Franco's office had worked with local municipalities as well as the main government, like PDVSA, like the oil company, right? Which is what funds everything, simultaneously. So that issue of resiliency is not only being able to create the spaces, but it's also being able to negotiate with these actors, right? Where you have to really swallow before you go to a meeting, because it's like sleeping with the enemy, right? So in that sense, I admire that capacity, because I don't have it, and to deal with that, and it's based on the faith on the city. So it's based on the faith of doing something that benefits more people, and that you as an actor, you become sort of a medium that you sort of receive that and just distribute it, and just sort of have to let it go, and the end result is what's important, right? Which is the community and it's the city. Also, because a firm like MAA Plus, like Franco's firm, will also do activism, which is something we don't do here. Margie Nothard, maybe, when she did the Fort Lauderdale, the Kennedy homes, she had to do with all the community, with all the people. It's the only example that I see, like that. It's not that I know everything, all the architects practicing here, but when I first heard, and when she talked about her work, I was like, this is something that we will do in Caracas, because you have to deal with so many people to get something built. And it's the time, the length of time could be, like 3-4
years.
But it's not only years, it could be like 3 different majors, 3 different politicians that change and they want different stuff. And that is resilience. You have to deal with the next and the next that wants something totally different.
At the granular level, right?
Yes.
Talking to...
Yeah, because on the other hand, it's like you have to become the voice of the community, because political actors come and go. But the community is always there. So in the end, you realize the client is the community, even though the one who's paying or building or financing or conceiving the process, it is an institution. But in the end, institutions come and go. In fact, as Henry has said, some projects might take even 10 years, so which is 3 municipalities in time, and they survive sometimes, so which is a major challenge.
Maybe one last question from me, and then we can pass it to questions from the audience. So we had an exhibition here about 2 years ago on Miami and the tropical world, and we're now working on a book project to tie that all together. And so I just wanted to sort of, Henry, who you're kind of, both worlds, Miami, Caracas, Franco, Caracas. I'm just curious how you engage with the tropics, with the tropical world. It's probably much more present in Venezuela than we consider it here, even though we pretty much share a climate, right? So,
well, first thing, I will say we had great masters on that. I mean, Villanueva and all the modern architects actually developed the city of the 20th century, gave us a lot of lessons in that sense. And in fact, things such as air condition happened fairly late, like in the 70s, and that actually changed a little bit the conditions of architectural projects in the country, which wasn't necessarily happy or successful in a way. So I guess, but also this issue of sustainability, for instance, was actually inherent to good architecture. So we didn't make a deal out of being sustainable in a place like Venezuela, because good architecture has to be sustainable by itself. I mean, otherwise it's non-common sense.
Right.
So in that sense, for us, the notion of tropicality also has to do with the difference in geography. Venezuela is a tropical country, but it could vary a lot, from cities in the Andes, or city on the coast, or city on the south, which is almost the jungle of the Amazonias, you know what I mean? So tropics is a very wide term. It varies from Brazil to Venezuela or to the islands in the Caribbean, because then you have to be sensitive, for instance, hurricanes, which we don't have. We do have earthquakes. We do have heavy seasons of rain that are important in terms of design. You have to protect a building from the impact of rain or from the contrast of sun exposure versus heavy rain conditions, which is a capacity that you begin learning by experiencing buildings and studying them on architecture school. It's almost something that you have to somehow do constantly as a student of architecture in order to make good projects in a way. Probably being conscious of the transformations of technology, right? That is almost part of the process of time in architecture, but being reasonable about the good logic of architecture, which I think is the basis of our work. For instance, in the few buildings I showed today, there's always this presence of sun control elements, cross ventilation in most of the buildings, this notion that you don't have to depend on mechanical ventilation, pretty much. The notion that you could actually go up from different systems of circulation, almost as a way to enjoy the space of architecture. It's also a good excuse, a good way to understand the notion of internal space as well.
Go ahead.
Well, I could only add something that I always discuss with my students here in Miami. It's also the sort of cultural differences in understanding the tropics and the fact of the tolerance, right? So, in Caracas, you're always exposed to the weather, to cross ventilation, to insects, mosquitoes, everything is right there. Frogs, lizards, like everything is in your house. It's not sealed, protected as it is here. It's just a different condition, right? I guess it's the same thing in terms of the temperature, the winds, the light. It changes here. It's a little bit more dramatic, where Caracas is more constant. But the difference is more cultural, like the way people accept the sort of the elements is different than the way we deal with them every day. And also it's interesting because Franco showed the maps, and we went from like a very colonial city with the Spanish colonial, like south of Spain colonial architecture, that was basically what the colony did in the Americas, to a modern city, right? So the examples of tropical architecture were like, boom, into like, Villanueva and all these masters, right? So sort of in the collective sort of imaginarium is tropical architecture is modern, it's modern architecture in a way. So it's Brasilia, and it's Niemeyer, Lucio Costa, it's all that stuff. And with the differences and all that, but when Caracas has the privilege of the altitude, right? So it's
stable.
by the coast, but it's 1,000 meters above that. So
Is this image of Villanueva, is that part of the national identity in a sense?
In a way,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Particularly Universidad Central, because it's the largest university of the country, the oldest one, and there is sort of a sense of pride for students of a university that becomes an institution. And in fact, politically speaking, university are probably the only institutions that haven't fell down yet from the political control of the country. So, and in fact, it's because of the pride and the caring and the respect that universities have had in history during the 20th century, pretty much everywhere in Venezuela. So architecture becomes the face of the institution in a way, and people recognize that.
So I just wrote this down. Universities are the most resilient.
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so perhaps we could open this to questions from the audience. Yes.
As you spoke about what's been happening in Venezuela and the revolution, I asked myself, when you study Venezuela's architecture that has been built during this revolution and developed during that time, do you see it as part of our future in the city of Caracas, or do you imagine a reshaping of the city if the revolution were to vanish?
It's a good question. Cities and countries never die. I mean, they survive almost anything, either natural phenomena or political revolutions or whatever, right? The thing is that when we talk about what's happening in the revolution, there is many things. I mean, for instance, all the work I did was done during the revolution, in a way. So it depends on the kind of revolution you speak about, right? But in the end, whatever's happened, something that we have to study further. For instance, all these housing projects from Gran Misión Vivienda are part of regular studies that we're doing already in the universities, because we cannot wait until they become ghettos or dangerous places in order to begin doing something about them. Because of we already identify the problems they have, right? The opportunities they may produce for the users of the building, but for the community in itself, because there is sort of tension in between these housing buildings and the context and the previous owners of the buildings around them. So these are issues that are probably typical in history, that you could actually find good reference about how to deal with that. And probably at the same time, you have to find out, what are the specific conditions of the future of Venezuela. So in that sense, this notion of utopia that I said before is pretty much necessary in order to have a clear image for the future. Otherwise, the task is going to be chaotic and probably not very clear yet. So we need to plan for the future, otherwise the future is going to be there and we'll be probably less prepared than we were for the revolution itself, okay? So again, youngers are going to have a great responsibility in that sense.
Yes, up there.
I noticed that you speak about the community and how the community helps you working all on your projects and the different governments that can have. How's the approach of that community? How's that first interaction that you have with them, especially with close communities that can be in Caracas or Latin American cities?
Okay, there are many ways to work in communities. There's people, architects in Venezuela, that work directly with community, not only doing the project, also doing the construction by themselves, probably with some finance, process of economic support to the project. In my case, most of the projects I've done are pretty much done with the community, but with an institution as well. You know what I mean? For instance, the school in Chacao was actually done continuously with the community, either from the selection of the site in which the school was going to be built, the process of identification of the program that was going to be needed, with the participation both from the people that used to work in the school as well as the community that will be the user of the school, either the actual community that was using the spaces of the previous school, which was a house, and the future community that wanted to be part of the project in a way. So neighbors, even though they're not going to use the school, were also part of the project. They will approve the project itself, and they will even approve the money from the budget of the municipality that was going to be invested in the construction, and they will actually be participating by law in the process of monitoring the process of construction and the investment of the money in the community. That doesn't happen everywhere. We know there is a lot of corruption in a place like Venezuela, and the highest the level of the government, the most corrupted it is. But when there is a community involved in the process, it's most difficult that could happen. So I think in the end, the role of communities is very wide. It goes from design, program, execution of the work, and everything. And I'm very confident of that. In some cases, you get political situations. For instance, when we did Alcaldía Baruta, the Chavista sector of the community was against the project because it was actually promoted by the mayor of the city that was against Chavez. So they actually vandalized somehow the construction at the very beginning. They denounced the project with the Institute of Heritage of the country because it was actually destroying the heritage of the town and everything. So we actually dealt with them, we dealt with the differences, and eventually we went along the project, and they were actually part of the people that were invited to the opening of the building. So in the end, it's always a process that you work along with the institution in the end, because I think that's part of the project. If there's no institution, the community at some point will be alone without the architect, and then you'll become the institution itself. You know what I mean? And there is a need that any project will somehow create a more stable structure for the future of any project. Otherwise, it's always a continuous process of improvisation in which the community feels abandoned in a way. So institutionalization for me is a major agenda when you talk about participation in a way.
Great. Yes.
Hi.
Is insecurity an aspect that you deal with in the design process,
Yeah.
or after you do it, and how effective?
It's everywhere. Insecurity is in our lives in a place like Venezuela. So you deal with insecurity from the very moment you wake up until you go to bed. And it's difficult because in some cases, I didn't show some of those projects. We did some student projects for the community of Petare, small parks. And in fact, the students at the beginning wanted to make open public spaces, very, very, integrated to the community, and the community was the one that actually asked for fences or barriers that would actually define security for the users as well as for the preservation of the space from vandalism or whatever. So somehow we train our students to deal with that as a process. And in some cases, we see some of these installations that Caracas has everywhere, fences, walls, as temporary conditions that eventually will be removed, probably, in better times. And so we don't pay so much attention to that as a problem. So we don't want to make it as an issue of design, so you actually make a statement about the design of the fence, but you make it as an instrument of a project in a way, in which different conditions, for instance, in the school as well, we define the fence as part of the request of the community and the institution. I was part of a project from the very beginning. Again.
Great. Other questions? Yes.
Tomás.
Franco, and also how do you see this moment in the country as an opportunity to help you guys with this excellent idea of the foundation? Because I think the Fundación is an excellent idea, especially in the moment when the exchange, the money exchange is so favorable to put money into the country. How do you see this opportunity as an opportunity to get an invitation of all the professionals that can be involved in helping you guys doing what you're doing in Venezuela?
Everybody's welcome.
Yeah, I guess I'm always, I know. I'm always optimistic in general. Otherwise, I won't wake up living in a place like Caracas. You have to be optimistic in the end, even if there is all the things we know that are happening, there's always a possibility for a future. So as a foundation, we try to somehow, as Henry said, to do things that we cannot do through the university, even though we don't get as many funds, except for very specific projects like the one that we're doing right now. Eventually, for me, the most important thing for the conceptualization of a future is not about money, it's about ideas. The best capital we have is the human resource that we have, which is the one that we're losing in a place like Venezuela, which is the most tragic event of the last say, 10, 15 years, which has been very slow, but now it's become really, really fast. Because once you lose human resources, there's very little way to go out, right, with the problems we have. So again, what we're trying to do is how to actually keep people active in a place like Venezuela through the possibility to integrate ideas, to make discussions. It's difficult to be political, but in the end, it's not about individual work. It is about the collective, which is the key in order to face the future, not only in terms of the political, economical, and social situation of the country, but also in terms of the architecture that we plan to do in the future. So I guess dark times are excellent times to think about the future. I mean, when there's little work, there is a lot of time to think. Probably the needs for publication, to register studies and projects that have been done in time in universities or private proposals. I think it's a good time to do records of that, to study the past, analyze the present in order to promote a better future. That's probably the only agenda I could have.
I mean, yeah, one thing is we, in a way, the Fundación Espacio became this kind of institution between Latin American countries where people will go to Caracas, we will invite lecturers, and they will come in very difficult times, you know, very insecure, and we will tour them around the city, and we're not really sort of exposing any sort of political positions or anything, but there was a lot of curiosity on what was going on in Venezuela in those years, and we basically exposed everything, which was it's sort of the main reason for this institution to exist. It's just to put things on the table and bring, you know, create discussions and conversations. It's always been open to everybody and projects and everything, because we started doing this by, you know, with sponsors, private sponsors that were basically, you know, our sort of providers and contractors and people that were working with us in the construction of the projects. And we have too many projects to still go on, like, you know, books that we need to publish, books that we need to finish, things that right now it's very difficult to bring people back to Venezuela because it's very unsafe. But I mean, there's still a lot of things to do, right? From here, you know, and
Yeah.
Elisa Silva, for instance, she did a fantastic book, Caba, on the sort of register all the mappings of all the slums and sort of informal settings of Caracas. And she did it like 2 years ago. This is like a long research, and it's been sort of widely recognized outside. So, you know, it's like, and that's one of it's like bigger than architecture sometimes, you know, like bigger than doing a building. So.
Maybe one last question. Yes. Last question.
The best
I can
advice?
hardly hear.
The best advice for?
Like, which is the best advice for the professional? It's going to happen like political things and economical things too. So what is the best maybe recommendation to us?
Do you mean as a young architect
In Miami?
in Miami?
With money?
I don't think there is an advice. I mean, people don't follow advices, in my opinion, in general. But, I mean, the only advice is to follow yourself. I mean, basically your own idea, goals, dreams, and go for it. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's in Miami or Haiti or Venezuela. Basically, do whatever you feel you can do and do it as good as you can. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's doing, I don't know, either interior design, public architecture, social architecture. The labels doesn't matter. I mean, don't matter that much. I mean, I think you could be as relevant in one of the other fields. And I think what's important is to be the best of whatever you can do. I mean, it's not a matter of competition. It's a matter of giving the most you can give to your own agenda, I guess. But I don't know if that's an advice, but if you have a good one, go ahead. I don't have any.
All right. First of all, Franco, thank you so much for,
Thank you for the
going over with
opportunity.
us all this incredibly productive stuff and interesting things you're doing in Venezuela. Henry, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all. And
Please.
good night.